2001: A Space Odyssey was born of the genius of two giants, legendary filmmaker Stanley Kubrick and visionary science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke. Together, they set out to make what they called the proverbial good science fiction movie, along with an amazing team of artists, technicians, and actors. They created a masterpiece. In the process, they changed cinema forever.
The most powerful idea in 2001 is that you have no way of pinning it down. There is no literal aspect to it, and it makes you uncomfortable. But it's also beautiful because we don't fully understand, literally, the universe, and all of the explosion of ideas, I think, defines something that makes 2001 unique in modern mythology.
If you think about science fiction cinema, if you think about the history of science fiction cinema, you can really measure it in terms of before Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey and after 2001: A Space Odyssey. Going all the way back to the very, very early days of film, there were a handful of really groundbreaking visionary movies. Think of George Méliès's A Trip to the Moon, think of Fritz Lang's Metropolis, Things to Come, that were very, very far-reaching, and they were innovative for their day. But after that point, it turned into a B genre.
Prior to 2001, it was all kind of UFOs and flying saucers.
There were obviously standouts, things like Forbidden Planet, The Day the Earth Stood Still.
The tone of those films was more serious and took the subject matter at its value. In the 1950s, Destination Moon was one of the few real attempts at a hard science fiction movie until 2001.
It's interesting, I got to know Christiane Kubrick, Stanley's widow. She and Stanley would read science fiction before 2001 was crystallized as a project. As she said to me, science fiction was just one step removed from pornography on the social acceptance scale at that time. That cultural landscape was one that Kubrick sensed an opportunity within.
My impression of Kubrick's whole career is that he just did what he wanted. He never did anything the way that was cheapest or easiest. Kubrick's movies are some of the only ones I've ever heard about that didn't seem subject to normal Hollywood rules. He didn't even make that many movies, and every single one is a masterpiece.
We're talking about a great artist here, somebody who always wanted to best himself.
Anytime a new Stanley Kubrick film came out, it was an event. He took his time and spent years in preparation, and each film was so distinctly different.
Roger Karras, who Stanley had met at Columbia Pictures when he was shooting Spartacus and later worked for Stanley. He was having lunch with Stanley at Trader Vic's. Stanley was living up on the West Side at this time in New York.
Roger Karras was then head of publicity, I think, for Columbia Pictures.
And Roger asked Stanley what he was up to, and he said, well, he wanted to make a picture about aliens.
At that time, Kubrick would say, well, I'm not sure you're going to find this worthy, but science fiction, you know.
And so Roger said, why don't you talk to Arthur Clarke? He's the best. And he said, well, he's crazy, lives in a tree and so on, and he's not. He said, no, he's not crazy. He's good.
And Clarke, of course, was keenly interested because he'd always wanted to break into film.
Arthur came to New York, holed up in room 803 in the Chelsea Hotel, and he and Stanley worked every day for months. The greatest genius in film and the greatest genius in science fiction writing got together.
Arthur, for example, brought up his idea that the jump into space was as important on an evolutionary scale as the movement from the sea to the land of life.
We're far too close to the beginning of the space program to see it in its real perspective. The analogy, which has now become a cliche, that it's like life's emergence from the sea onto land, is perfectly true. And just as a fish couldn't have begun to conceive of what was going to happen on the land in the next few 100 million years, so we can't possibly imagine what's going to take place in space.
So he believed that the space age heralded the beginning of a next stage of evolution. And 2001: A Space Odyssey is all about 3 stages of evolution: pre-human, human, and post-human.
Arthur had great vision. He was also a delightful person. One thing he and Stanley had in common, you could talk about anything with them, both Renaissance men.
Clarke and Kubrick walked all over Manhattan brainstorming about what to film for months and months and months. There were a number of stories that were optioned by Kubrick's production company, Polaris, including The Sentinel.
I was a science fiction fan when I was a teenager, and my mother always brought me the collections of the best science fiction of whatever year it was. I think it was 1950 or 1951, when a short story by Arthur C. Clarke was included called The Sentinel. It was about a strange artifact discovered buried on the moon that was a cosmic alarm clock by a passing intelligence which could have been millions of years before.
And in the story, they take months and months to crack a crystal pyramid. It wasn't a monolith, it was a crystal pyramid. And at the end of the story, Clark's narrator says, this is probably something like a burglar alarm, and it sent a signal to the stars that we have made it to the moon. I wonder how quickly they're going to come.
Years later, when I was offered the part of Dave Bowman in 2001, something sounded awfully familiar about the section on the moon, and I realized I had read that short story years ago.
Kubrick, to his credit, I think, understood that Arthur had not written a screenplay, and so he proposed that they collaborate to write a science fiction novel, and that then they would make a script from the novel.
You really have two authors of this story. Kubrick made the movie and Clarke did the book, and they were doing it in tandem.
Stanley was consulting Arthur repeatedly throughout, and Arthur made significant contributions to simplify the story in the middle of production.
You know, in my mind, Clarke's novel is the left brain, experiencing this story, and Kubrick's the right side of my brain, this very emotional, almost unknowable version of events that define man's place in the universe.
Kubrick methodically built on the concepts in the screenplay and in the emerging novel, and found nonverbal ways to tell the story.
Kubrick just wouldn't accept the literalism that I guess, you'd get from reading the book.
There was some tension with Arthur there as well, because Arthur was being asked to write voiceover narration to explain what was happening. So Arthur got kind of upset when he realized that his labored over voiceover texts were not going to be used. With all respect to Arthur, who I admire greatly, it saved the movie. Because rather than explaining, spoon-feeding the audience what was going on the screen, you have ambiguity. Whenever Stanley could choose ambiguity rather than explaining what was happening, he had the courage, and he chose ambiguity in this film.
I think that Kubrick was very concerned about creating a story that was plausible and realistic in its approach, working with engineers and learning about how actual space exploration and space hardware worked and functioned, and what was not only occurring at the time, but also projected into the future. He put together a think tank, not the typical film production design teams that would work in science fiction. It was aerospace engineers.
Actually, 2001 was a giant research and development project. They wanted to get to truths.
Kubrick and Clarke were able to involve Frederick Ordway and Harry Lange, who were working with Wernher von Braun at the Marshall Space Flight Center. Ordway was basically the person who developed all the documents and the reports and speeches for von Braun, and Lange would then illustrate them. So you really had in those two men the A-team of design in terms of what the future of spaceflight might look like. And then they in turn got involved with Tony Masters, who was the production designer for the film, who had worked on Lawrence of Arabia, and the three of them, consulting with Kubrick and Clarke, were able to just design the whole world of 2001 from the ground up.
Masters had a gift for understanding and building kinetic sets and kinetic structures. So much of what you see that's fascinating and believable in the film was his idea. And he knew how to work also with some of the consultants brought in from NASA.
And so really what Kubrick got was people who were right on the cutting edge of technology. Every set, every tool had to look authentic, which meant that everything they build had to be detailed and plausible, and it had to be thought out, and it had to be functional to a certain degree.
I think their focus was on practicality and realism. If you look at the lunar module, for example, it's sort of unwieldy. It doesn't look like an aircraft, more of a collection of shapes that are functional that allow you to get where you need to go and do what you need to do. And I think they looked at a lot of that when they were creating the spacecraft for 2001, making sure that there were thrusters. They looked at the fact that NASA was looking into ceramics, and so it was very important to them to project where this kind of technology and materials were heading.
Kubrick was utterly committed to realism. No back-screen projection.
Kubrick decided blue screen didn't work. Blue screen was not technically proficient enough back in the 1960s for his movie to look realistic.
Kubrick had studied very carefully a film produced by the National Film Board of Canada in the early 60s called Universe, which succeeded in conveying galaxies and nebulae using tanks of black liquid in which oil paint was dropped and filmed at high frame rates under bright light. Something about that technique produced very believable nebulosity that was understandable as being interstellar. But that technique was studied very carefully by Kubrick, and he reproduced it, but now on 65mm film in the Upper West Side in 1964 with very toxic solvents with paint poured on them, and it was all filmed at high frame rate. So the material that Kubrick shot was then used in a reel that they showed MGM and other potential backers to secure financing for the film. It was that early.
You can imagine Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke both at the 1964 World's Fair, and they see a film called To the Moon and Beyond. They immediately were like, who are the people behind this? Gentlemen like Con Pedersen and Graphic Films in Los Angeles. They contacted them, and that's the beginning of the journey that led to the visual effects in 2001.
Kubrick realized when he went off to England to work on actual production that it was too far away, that he wanted the crew to be with him while he was shooting and in post-production. But Doug wanted to go work for Kubrick. He talked to Con Pedersen. He said, look, Doug, I can't tell you how to contact him. But I will say, if you look on the bulletin board in the office, you might find something that you would find useful. And of course, there was Kubrick's number, and Doug just called him up.
Well, what Kubrick did have was some very smart people to work with. Douglas Trumbull, Con Pedersen, Wally Weavers, people that had wanted the opportunity to take something further. Work with a director that said, we have no interference from the studio because they're in the United States and we're in London. Let's take this as far as it can be taken. They basically committed to raising the bar.
Stanley was determined that what we did was going to be as good as we could possibly do. We were never held short of money or anything to do what we wanted, which led to the quality that turned out in the end.
One of the things that was a real challenge for them is the discovery. So you can imagine the difficulties in catching it in camera and keeping it all in focus and lighting it consistently. It moves so slowly on camera, which I think actually lends to the sense of majesty and the enormity of the spacecraft, right? The bottom line is you have this huge miniature that they had to sometimes expose multiple times.
Though they didn't have computer-controlled motion control, they did have stepper motors on some of the camera platforms so that they could do a movement within a certain amount of time and repeat that almost.
It was quite a challenge for the crew.
They went through multiple designs of it. Lange was involved, in all of them. And, at one point, because it was a nuclear-propelled spacecraft, it had radiators radiating out to dissipate heat, but it looked like it had wings, and people were saying, well, why would a deep space spacecraft need wings? And that was too confusing. So they spent a lot of time doing it. They had all agreed on the design of it.
I was involved with the models and shooting all those with Stanley. We shot all the models against black velvet, and they were constructed well. And then Doug Trumbull and I added bits of plastic kit for details just to give it a bit more life.
The kit bashing thing, what they're doing is they're taking really detailed parts out of plastic model kit and gluing those on to create the impression of detail. There are a few of them on the Ares, and that was where 2001 really made it seem very realistic. And it was all about the mechanical language of how these parts are applied in a thoughtful way so that it actually looks like it does something. Pieces of trucks, Jeeps, there's missiles, there's all kinds of odds and ends that are put onto it. But those little bits and pieces that have a lot of detail to them give a level of authenticity to it that automatically kind of make it more believable. You combine that with doing a paint job. It's funny, the Ares, if you look at it, there's a lot of oil leaking out of the Ares, but the weathering really helps sell the realism.
The moon bus basically came in and it was showroom clean. One of the other things that Doug worked on was detailing these models. It was his job to dirty it up and make it look real, taking a card and an airbrush and creating panel lines and dirt marks. This pioneered the way that models are detailed.
They basically sort of invented a new book when it came to miniature photography and the approach of how to capture those sorts of elements in camera and on stage.
Making large enough miniatures to be able to photograph them clearly and with proper lenses was part of that, and the desire to make everything in latent image.
Traditional visual effects quite often duplicates film on an optical printer, meaning that you make a copy of an element and add it to another element. That's another copy. When you do that, it gives you flexibility to create imagery that you couldn't make before, but it does degrade the image slightly. Because it's a photochemical process, it adds a little bit more grain. Maybe the image is a little softer, a little blurrier because it has to go through another lens system. It's not as pristine and beautiful as camera original film that would have been taken on the set. So Held take, or latent image, means that you photograph that scene, but instead of sending it to the lab and processing it, you reserve it for an additional exposure on that same piece of film.
But it's a scary process because what you got is what you got in the freezer, which is terrifying to me.
It's risky because if you make a mistake, you've destroyed the entire take. But the payoff is a camera original pristine image that cuts perfectly with regular production footage, an undetectable illusion.
A lot of the shots that are done in the film are actually created on the animation stand, not on the model filming stand. The elements are brought together and animated along the paths that they've determined, all in basically 2D. They would have a cutout of the ship that is a large format photograph of the ship, and they could choreograph it in a certain movement and have the background, whether it's stars or the earth, move in sort of counterpoint to it. They were able to do a lot of those shots that way. You can sort of tell in the movie where that is done because there's not a lot of parallax or change of angle of the models, but they're still amazingly beautiful and incredibly choreographed.
Well, the mindset was we had to do the best job we could. With Doug Trumbull, who was, in my humble estimation, a genius, he made sure that everything we did was as good as we could make it. We had various rigs to make planet surface. And in those days, NASA was just coming back with images of the moon, and it turned out most things were fairly smooth. So what we did was we got lots of plaster, colored it with gray to make it look like moon gray, and then poured it all over about a 8-foot by 8-foot section. Got a brush with water and flicked it onto the plaster, so you got all the craters, all those perfectly round craters. And then we photographed that, and then we made large sections of it, which we rephotographed and added things to.
Kubrick's perfectionism was implacable. Kubrick's perfectionism literally drove people to seek psychiatric help.
Stanley was very intense in his requirements. Stanley wanted to have the best of the best.
Stanley had a reputation as a perfectionist, but I think that was because he was so well prepared and expected everyone else to be so, too.
The meticulousness is his madness and his brilliance.
My first day of shooting, he took one look at Gary's and my shoe, that's Gary Lockwood's, and my shoes, and decided they weren't right. So we didn't shoot that day. I was in awe of Stanley. And that first week of shooting, I think he could sense that tension that I had. And he looked me aside after a few days of shooting and said, "Keir, I think you are a wonderful actor, and I'm so glad to have you playing the part." That broke the tension, and I loved shooting this film from there on in.
Kubrick was very much a filmmaker who wanted to show you things that you had never seen before. Shooting in CinemaScope, shooting in that large format.
He shot with a lot of wide lenses, and he wanted every single inch of that frame to mean something.
Because he was a photographer himself, there was always an interaction between him and Jeffrey Unsworth, the DOP. Stanley would tell Jeffrey Unsworth what the f-stop was.
He was obsessed with framing, elaborate master shots, and the composition was balanced, the movement was dynamic.
Kubrick was used to holding the camera himself a lot, setting the frames, setting the lenses, setting the compositions, and the result was complete believability.
There's not a lot of dialogue in this film, and Stanley didn't give us a lot of direction. Most of the time, we spent on technical things, the lighting and the camera angle, and we had to do multiple takes for various technical reasons. And I never minded because Stanley was always right.
The really cool thing about 2001 is the way that they were able to achieve weightlessness. So in today's filmmaking, we do a lot of wire work, and it's really easy to do now because we can use computers to just paint those wires out. They couldn't do that at that time period in 2001, so they would have to hang the actor from the ceiling and then put the camera directly underneath them so that the actor's body was actually hiding the wires.
It's a miraculous way to show zero-G because they're sort of dangling there. Obviously, they probably shot them at a higher frame rate to smooth out their movements and slow them down a bit.
I discovered, for example, that whole epic story of Bill Weston, the stuntman, and how he was hanging over a camera placement in his spacesuit on a cable 3 stories above it, spinning above this camera crew that if he fell, by the way, he would have killed him and himself. He had a little tank where the bigger EVA oxygen tank unit was on his back. There was no rebreather possibility. There was no way of getting carbon dioxide out of his suit. But if the carbon dioxide is not being taken out, then you're going to gradually go unconscious. And he approached Stanley at one point and said, "Stanley, can we please cut some holes in the back of the helmet so that I can breathe?" And Kubrick would have none of it because he was afraid light would bleed in from film lights or something would bleed in and destroy the illusion. Even people who were kind of driven a little crazy by Stanley Kubrick's perfectionism, they saw that he was the first person there and the last person to leave. They saw him lose weight and get haggard and grow a beard and look 10 years older at the end of the production than he looked when they started. You know, they saw him giving everything.
Stanley Kubrick, a really masterful filmmaker, is also not afraid to go back to what people had done in the past, because we have 70 years of great problem solving in the film industry before that movie was done. Kubrick was able to look at a 1951 movie called Royal Wedding, in which Fred Astaire did a dance where in the movie he appears to climb up a wall and go over the ceilings. And that was achieved by building a set that rotated on a gimbal, and by mounting the camera on the set so that it rotated with it, Fred Astaire could, as the building moved, could walk around and filmed in his normal way so that you could dance standing up, but he would appear in the movie to be filmed upside down. And Stanley Kubrick looked at that and said, that's how we can achieve weightlessness. But he really pushed the boundaries on that by taking, instead of a small, teeny little room that rotated, he built a set the size of a house and rotated that around.
That was something that was very, very different in 2001, is they actually dealt with the concept that there's no artificial gravity, like you see in Star Trek or Star Wars. So the idea of using centrifugal force inside the spacecraft, like the Discovery or the giant space station, these rotating structures allow the crew to basically stick to the floor and kind of simulate gravity.
The centrifuge was basically a giant Ferris wheel with movable walls. It was built in England by Vickers Aircraft and was about 60 feet tall. And it rotated and could be separated so that when the two halves were pushed together, it was self-contained universe of a spaceship. There was this little tiny space between the two halves where a rod with a camera could be inserted so that it could track us as it rotated. There were some shots where Gary and I had to step forward to turn on the camera and then step back and start the scene.
I think Kubrick took this one step further by not necessarily having the camera locked all the time. The act of changing the perception of the audience is one of Kubrick's greatest bag of tricks in this movie. One other wonderful instance in 2001 is when the stewardess is on the Aries and she just sort of walks up the side of the wall and then walks into the cockpit, even though the orientation of the cockpit is somewhat different than the interior of the miniature.
She's basically walking in place, but the illusion is that she's walking, flipping upside down and changing her orientation. So another magical moment.
The pen floating in the Pan Am Space Clipper cabin was actually done very simply. The pen was just stuck to a big glass disc which rotated slowly. It created the illusion that the pen was drifting in weightlessness without the need for wires or blue screen. The scene where Dave Bowman is in the pod and he uses the explosive bolts to blast him into the airlock is truly amazing and quite dangerous, actually. They have him basically dropped from the pod towards the camera.
We couldn't use a stunt double because the whole point is that my character has forgotten his helmet in his hurry to rescue his colleague. The way we did it is this. I was standing 2 stories up on top of a platform, off camera, next to a circus roustabout who was wearing very thick gloves. The camera was on the floor 2 stories down, and on action, when they blasted the smoke, I jumped head first toward the camera. I had a wire under my costume that had a huge knot in it, and when that knot reached the gloved hands of the circus guy, he jumps off and hurtles, and I go hurtling back up like a block and tackle. Luckily, we did it in 1 take, and Stanley's the only director that I would have done that for, I promise you. One of my favorite moments in the film is the Dawn of Man sequence, when Dan Richter, who played Moonwatcher, the main ape man, is fiddling with the bone and cocks his head a couple of times, like he's thinking about something unusual. When his brain figures out the first tool, Dan did such an amazing job that I had people come up to me thinking these were real apes. All of the Dawn of Man was filmed after I was wrapped. I remember being astounded by what Stanley had created.
Stanley had already shot all of the live action of the picture, but he didn't have an opening.
Kubrick had tried multiple ways of trying to present pre-human beings in a convincing way.
They had tried many things. They had tried actors, stuntmen, and nothing worked. Everything had been rejected by Stanley. And so through mutual friends of Arthur's, my name came up as a wonderful mime in London. And so I was asked to come out and let Stanley pick my brain. And I went out there not thinking I was looking for a job. I wasn't interested in Hollywood or big pictures. I was still into my experimental theater ideas, sort of a pretentious young intellectual. And so I went out and met with Stanley. And there was this scruffy guy, hair all over the place. And finally we came down to how would a mime approach doing the opening? And I said, I think it's a question of willing suspension of disbelief. I think it's an acting problem. The movement must be the result of acting, and you've got to be able to grab the audience by the balls right away. If you give me half an hour, a black leotard, 2 towels, and a stage, I'll show you. I put this leotard on, and then I stuck these towels so that my shoulders would be bigger. And I went out there and I started going around, and I looked at him angrily, and Stanley started saying, I love it. And I said, your tribe of apes are like Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. Each one has to be a recognizable character. This is really complicated. Once we figure the movement out so that it's believable with a costume, because the acting values have to come through. So it's going to take a long time.
That was another one of those great collaborations between people with complementary talents. And that was Dan Richter and then Stuart Freeborn, the great makeup artist who ended up working on Star Wars later and did Wookiees and Yoda.
Stuart had things that I said, well, I can't use these hands. I can't express myself. What he had as a mask was impossible. The eyes were hidden back inside. There was no movement of the face. The body was all packed up so that there was no way to express yourself. Stuart and I worked for months. Stanley had hired Stuart because he was one of the greatest makeup artists in the history of English cinema. I had the privilege of getting to work with him every day for 8, 9, 10 months. I had to be able to project a character with acting values.
And Freeborn was pushed to the limits of his capabilities by Stanley, who kept on asking for more and more and more realism. The net result was Dan Richter in a form-fitting Australopithecus costume, actually, which had the ability so that the face could register different emotions due to little toggles inside, and it was just extraordinary virtuoso work.
Stuart Freeborn deserved an Academy Award for those costumes and the makeup of the ape men.
The initial plan was for the African veldt sequences to be filmed on location. Shooting on distant location like that just wasn't going to work with all of the makeup, all of the ape suits. So Kubrick sent a second unit crew to shoot large transparencies, 8x10 ectochromes, of the African plain. So back in England, they built a foreground set representing the small area where the early hominids lived. But the background was projected, and it was those large phototransparencies, and it gave those scenes an enormous amount of scope.
It's really hard to get a bright enough image on a projection screen. That's why Tom Howard used what is called retroreflective material for the screen. That's the same stuff that makes highway signs so bright at night in your headlights. Of course, when the camera and projector are next to each other, you still get a shadow of the actors and other foreground objects. Howard's solution was to build a special rig with a half-silvered mirror, so the camera and projector were exactly aligned, so the actors' bodies hid their own shadows.
Anybody working in virtual production today on an LED volume would actually be very upfront with the fact that 2001 really set that template. And Kubrick was really ahead of the curve with that. He figured that out 40 years before anybody else.
People say, well, he took so many takes. Well, he took so many takes because we kept discovering things. Probably the best example of it is when I first pick up a bone and I'm going to eventually start breaking things and killing things. I don't even know how to hold it and whatnot, and I started playing with it, and one little rib bone that was in front of me went up in the air, and we were shooting MOS without sound, so I could talk to Stanley and he could talk to me. So I said, oh, I'm sorry, Stanley. And he said, no, I love it. Do it again. We played with the idea of a bone going so that finally the shot at the end, which was the great cut, was the culmination of that little mistake that I did by accident that Stanley discovered, and that together we perfected what became arguably one of the most important cuts in cinema history.
A lot of people might think that the great Stanley Kubrick was a gargantuan ego. I suppose you can't conceive to try to direct a film like that without having an ego. You have to have a kind of ego to think you can bring that off. But Christiane, his widow, and I had multiple conversations about his state of mind during the production, and there was a lot of self-doubt. Multiple points he would come back from a long day on the set and say to her things like, I don't know how to end this, I don't know what I'm doing.
Kubrick and Clark were very collaborative all throughout the process in terms of crafting the story, scene ideas, how it might end.
They didn't have an ending, and they were still locked in an intensive discussion.
There was even talk for a while that they were actually going to try to visualize extraterrestrials in the film.
And Clark had been in communication with a very young Harvard professor named Carl Sagan. He was not yet famous. Sagan had written a couple scientific papers about the probability or possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence and so on. So Clark said, why don't I bring down Carl Sagan? Perhaps we can address this question with him. So they had a dinner.
Sagan said, you should never show them. They should be beyond our capability to understand.
Stanley wanted to have an alien at some point, and Stewart painted me white and put black polka dots all over me, even my eyelids. So I'd close my eyes and there'd be a polka dot on the eyelid. And then I wore the skull cap and a really tight jock strap, and then painted my whole body. And so I would get out and I would move and it would do different formations. It didn't work. The goal was to create an alien somehow. So everybody was working on that.
The problem with that is that mankind cannot imagine the face of God. That's why we have the shape of the monolith, sort of representing that in our three-dimensional world.
And then, Sagan then tried to take credit later, saying, well, when I did see 2001 when it came out, I was happy to see that my suggestion had been accepted. What he didn't know was that behind the scenes of that was Kubrick saying, get rid of this guy, and no way am I going to follow his advice. But in the end, he was sort of forced to. The power of the aliens was conveyed by these cryptic monoliths. There was a tangible manifestation of alien intelligence.
The monolith in 2001 is classic science fiction. We've heard about NASA looking for biosignatures. Now NASA has created this whole new class called Look for Technosignatures. The monolith, if we look back, was a technosignature. They could be somewhere on Earth, they could be on the moon. I mean, that's the dream of science fiction, that we will find something like that. The idea that is in every culture, that either a god or an alien or somebody came down and said, this is how you plant crops, and we're going to twist your genes this way.
The aliens are echoes of strange voices in the hotel room at the end. That is enough to give us a feeling of strangeness, of we're being watched, of Bowman is being taken care of, to give us the idea that there is something more happening here.
My favorite set was that strange room at the end. It apparently was modeled after a real hotel in Paris, and the thinking is that the aliens somehow could read my thought memories and recreate for me this human habitat to make me feel more at home. What was so amazing about that set was the floor. It was entirely lit from underneath, so that in a way it was alien. I love how Stanley played with time and space in that sequence, where I see myself older, and my older self hears something and goes to look and doesn't see anything but my younger self in the red spacesuit. One of the suggestions that I made to Stanley that I'm proud to say he used is when I'm eating at the table, again, that elderly version, where I knock over the glass. I remember saying to Stanley that maybe I could do something a little different to distract my character that causes me to look over to the bed and see that old man version of me, even older, since in the earlier shot, it looks like I've heard something in the bathroom that makes me get up to look. I suggested knocking over the wine glass. It was Stanley, though, who turned it into art in the next shot where it shattered on the floor. It's such a powerful image, and I'm not sure what it means, but it resonates as a loss and aging. That makeup of the bald guy on the bed took 12 hours, and luckily we shot the scene in one day. When we shot the Stargate sequence, I had no idea what it would look like. I was sitting there in a close-up wearing my spacesuit. That was me moving, not the camera. I had to tense my face to the point where I was shaking, and since it was such an extreme close-up, it translates as a lot of movement. And he had lights flashing on my helmet, but that's my eye, by the way, in that extreme close-up.
So when it came to the production of the Stargate sequence, the most successful, I would say, was Doug Trumbull's slit scan material.
Doug Trumbull has said he was inspired by the work of John Whitney Sr. and his streak photography. Whitney had developed a technique he called slit scan, and this was keeping the camera shutter open while moving the art behind a slit and moving the camera towards the art. Trumbull invented an ingenious machine to do this automatically. This created a really dramatic perspective, and it was the key to Kubrick's Stargate sequence.
Then you had the aerial photography of Scotland. Andrew Birkin was in a helicopter over Scotland and filmed some of that material. And then another team filmed over Monument Valley. And then that material was run through various processes to invert all the colors and create this kaleidoscopic effect of flying over an alien world. In the early conceptions and storyboards, you saw the space pod and you saw it going through the Stargate. And that had the effect of distancing the audience from the experience that the astronaut was having through multiple dimensions. But then that was refined to the point where the audience was along for the ride, and the audience was in effect looking through Bowman's eyes as subjective observers rather than outside looking in. The return of Bowman in one way or another was baked in before they even conceived of what the destination of the spacecraft was supposed to be, Saturn or Jupiter or what. Kubrick showed up to a meeting with Clark with Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is this extraordinary look at the commonalities between human mythologies. And Campbell boiled it down to the mythical hero goes on a journey away from his people, enters a magical realm, and brings back knowledge important to his people. And this is common to almost every myth from any culture on Earth. So then later on, fast forward a year and a half after, Joseph Campbell's book is handed to Arthur Clarke, and they were trying to figure out how to end it, and Kubrick was leaning on Clarke, give me something. And Clarke came up with several ideas, none of which went anywhere, and then finally he wrote, Bowman is transformed into a floating fetus that orbits Earth. And Kubrick loved it. That served to bring the hero back with knowledge. And that's the mythical structure, the return of the mythic hero who goes off into the universe and comes back. In various versions, iterations of the script, the Star Child was going to be seen detonating those orbiting nuclear weapons. But Kubrick thought that was too close to Strangelove, it was too literal, and no need. I think he was right. I believe that in the novel it's still there. In which case, the Star Child is removing the tools, the weapons we have surrounded ourselves with, and the implication is we're entering a new stage of evolution. Childhood has ended. Throughout 2001: A Space Odyssey, you have this equation of use of weapons, tool as weapon, with success in the universe. So then Hal ends up killing off the entire crew, except for one survivor who kills him. Hal does that in ways that are not overtly using weapons, but he himself has become weaponized, let's say.
So when you think about the notion of artificial intelligence, the ultimate expression of that, an AI that is not only smarter than any human being, but smarter than all human beings combined, and it's also self-aware and maybe have its own desires and its own goals, well, that's Hal.
In the initial reviews of the film and even later, many people have pointed out that the astronauts were somewhat robotic, and the most human character in the last part of the film, or maybe in the whole film, was HAL 9000.
By the way, at the time, computers were room-sized things, and they envisioned this aware superintelligence in 1968. That's astonishing.
The acronym HAL, for heuristic algorithmic, was a suggestion of Marvin Minsky, one of the two lead roles in the artificial intelligence lab at MIT.
When Bowman goes in and removes the memory from Hal, you can't get a better moment than that.
That was the only time in the movie where my character shows any emotion, and is not so much emotion as holding it in. I don't say anything as Hal is begging me to stop. You can hear my breathing in the space helmet. It's only when he asks if I want to hear the song that he learned that I say, oh yeah, sing it to me. And so he sang Daisy Bell, which incidentally was actually the first artificial speech ever spoken by a computer in 1961. And I think at this point, my character does think of Hal as almost another crew member.
The breakdown that Hal has in the film makes you question how we teach artificial intelligence and how much we want it to become human-like.
What's interesting is that AI always felt like it was something that was hard to get right. And all of a sudden, ChatGPT comes out with a large language model, right, an LLM that is effectively HAL. That shows you where things are heading. I mean, we are definitely getting towards artificial general intelligence pretty quickly. I mean, the prediction is this decade. I think Kubrick's point there is that we don't really understand the technology that we're building. We know how to build mechanical life, LLMs, but we're not exactly sure how it works. At some point, it's hard for us to even understand why the things go wrong, and it's becoming more and more like a biological entity where we have to train it, we have to teach it. That's all we can do. We certainly can't program it. And that's the fascinating development that I think converges really nicely and in a way that I think is profound with the 2001 story.
2001, as I understand it, was kind of budgetless and kind of timeless. They just sort of said, yeah, like whatever you need.
We were way over budget. I mean, it was a real issue. But it got to the point where Stanley said, well, okay, the suits from MGM are coming over. We've got to put something together for them. Because they didn't know what was going on. They knew Stanley was on the edge of crazy. Were they really going to benefit on this one? He was doing things nobody had ever done before and not letting anybody know what he was doing.
He didn't like Hollywood. One reason Stanley Kubrick wanted to shoot it in England is that he had a maximum amount of distance between himself and Hollywood and any kind of supervision. It's the first time Kubrick ever saw his own film with all the effects shots cut in. It was at the huge MGM screening room with just the top brass in the front rows. That didn't go down very well. The top brass was kind of quiet and subdued and congratulating Stanley, but not really.
He hadn't really had a chance to see the complete film and sit and digest it for very long, see if there was any tweaking that sort of needed to be done.
But the screening that everybody remembers was in New York City a week later, and they were showing the film to industry elite and media. It was a disaster because the perception was this was a huge failure. This was a film that was on its way down. It was going to sink the studio, maybe. One of the people there remembers that Clark and Kubrick walked up the center aisle, and you could see tears in Clark's face. And people were leaving at the intermission.
And sure enough, the next morning, when all of the sort of New York area critic reviews came out, they were almost uniformly bombs.
The New York Times said it was somewhere between hypnotic and immensely boring. Pauline Kael called it trash masquerading as art and monumentally unimaginative.
And then they had a crisis meeting at MGM and decided to cut some material. So suddenly, after years of hard work and exactitude and perfectionism, Kubrick was in a position where he needed to trim his film.
Early in the film, you see Frank running on the treadmill on the Discovery, the giant wheel. And then a little bit later on, he showed Dave doing the same thing. And so they lifted that later scene out. But that was one of the scenes that notoriously triggered audiences. Apparently in the New York screening, there were people who just started like audibly complaining that like, oh my God, get on with it, because we've seen this before.
Interestingly, the reviews after those trims were made were much more positive. There's a mythology that the film was failing and then the young people came along, hippies or whatever, came along and saved the film. It's true that young people gravitated to the film, but they did it from the first day. It was successful from the first day. It really sold tickets from the first day.
Radio started to report that, hey, there are crowds outside this theater. So they were craving this experience, especially younger audiences who at the time, young people were obsessed with the space program. And the film starts to build an audience, and a lot of them saw it in sort of 65 millimeter, right? 2001: A Space Odyssey is a shocking experience when you see it on the big screen. Hal's eye fills your field of view. Even if you're prepared for it, it's a slap in the face. It's shocking.
Young people were coming back to see it 2 or 3 times, sometimes smoking funny cigarettes. That's when MGM changed the marketing campaign. They came out with the slogan that appeared in the new posters, 2001: A Space Odyssey, the ultimate trip.
Ultimately, 2001: A Space Odyssey became the #2 grossing film of 1968, after Funny Girl, I believe, and it's #1 if you consider all-time earnings. It's the #1 film of that year. When that film really started to tap into the public consciousness was when the Apollo 8 mission orbited the moon in December of that year, because we forget 2001 came out in April, and just 8 months later, human beings left Earth for the first time, went to the moon, orbited the moon, and brought back with them photographs not just of the moon's surface, but of the whole Earth from space. And so all of a sudden, the public consciousness was very much thinking about the fact that, oh my God, we're on a tiny planet in a vast cosmos. There's a whole set of perspectives that shift at that realization, I don't think anyone looked at space the same ever again. And I think at that moment, people realized 2001 is a really important film.
2001 is an influential film for many reasons, but the legacy is that it made humans really think about our capacity to travel and live in space.
First off, it's called 2001, A Space Odyssey. It was connected to what was going to be my lifetime, opposed to something like a Star Trek, which was hundreds of years in the future. This is a world that I was hoping to grow up and experience. It was a tour of the future.
Arthur C. Clarke's famous third law states that any sort of sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic, is something I come back to and think about a lot, and I think it's really explored in this film in particular. And that's why Arthur C. Clarke is such an important voice in 2001, because he did bring that idea of futurism.
I believe that when 2001 came out, it wasn't just a challenge, it was almost an opening to all these future filmmakers to rethink how they could tell the stories that were percolating in their souls and their minds with this new design language. And you have the testimony of many directors, you know, whether it's Spielberg or Lucas, saying how when they saw that movie, they felt inspired to go do their own version of that.
2001 was so far above everything else that nobody could touch it for years. I mean, it wasn't until we started doing the Star Wars movies where we were spending money on technology to push the envelope further than what Kubrick had done. But there's a huge gap between 2001 and everything else until we started to develop more interest in creating fantasy movies and visual effects like Star Wars. That was the first time since 2001 that a fusion of talent and money went into making something better than what you had seen before.
No other film that I can think of has anything like the ambition of 2001. 2001 traces the human species from pre-human to post-human and manages to convey that in a way that's utterly convincing. It's a philosophical meditation as much as it is some entertainment.
It represents the constant question, who are we and why are we here? Humanity's constantly going to keep asking questions. We're going to push ourselves further. We're going to get to that goalpost and we're going to push it further. And so that question never stops. And that's that cycle of just what it means to be human.
It wasn't just that 2001 was a groundbreaking film. It was that this storytelling motif, the tools that Kubrick used to tell the story were so transcendental, and how deeply powerful it is when you have to go outside the film to almost understand its place in your mind and your soul. It's incredible. And I think that's why 2001 needs to be part of the modern mythology of storytelling.
I knew 2001 was going to be important just because it was a Stanley Kubrick film, but I could never, ever dreamed that we'd still be talking about it over 50 years later. To me, Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey defined the modern science fiction film.